The wind bit through the forest like a question that refused to be answered, raking icy fingers across the ridgeline and rattling the panes of the small house Sarah had inherited from a woman she barely remembered. Snow piled at the doorstep in ragged dunes, a white bruise against the gray of the pines. The forecast had promised a light dusting and a bright afternoon, but forecasts had been another thing that had stopped meaning much in Sarah's year. She pressed her palm to the window glass and felt the vibration of the world beyond, a distant cadence that could be thunder or the old road settling, but felt to her like a heartbeat out of step. She wrapped her hands around a chipped mug and mouthed the mantra she used to steady herself. Just breathe, as if saying it enough could slow the tremor in her bones. In the kitchen, a skillet hissed where she reheated soup, steam smelling of burnt rosemary and canned tomato, comfortable in its ordinariness, until a sound split the house in half. It was not wind, not the old house settling, not the thud of a tree. It was an animal scratch at the door, precise and deliberate, as a knock, followed by a low, drawn-out howl that set the windows vibrating and slid under her ribs like a cold knife. Sarah froze, and then moved because there was nothing left to do but move. The scrape came again, closer, and the snow outside yielded two pairs of eyes at the glass, eyes amber and bright against the white, one almost yellow, the other the color of old coins. Blood stained the snow in a small, human-shaped smear. Something pressed its muzzle to the glass and exhaled warm breath, fogging a circle that smelled of musk and damp fur and something like smoke. Logic told her to lock the door and call the ranger. Compassion pulled at the hem of her sleeve, and the memory of a child she could not save from drowning 3 months earlier tightened her throat and loosened her resolve. Who goes out into a storm and asks for help without a plan? Who answers a plea at the door when the world has taught them to look away? What would she do now, with the pack waiting and the house on the edge of giving in to the weather? The answer began when she slid the bolt and opened the door. They were closer than she had thought. 2 wolves stepped over the threshold, as if the house had been theirs since the foundation was poured. The bigger one carried a limp, and the smaller, who watched her with bright alertness, kept glancing at the porch as if to check for more arrivals. Fur clung to the injured flank in ragged tufts, and a dark smear colored the snow beneath. Sarah felt the old first aid instincts wake in her, hands remembering bandages and iodine, a kit of first aid tucked under the sink like a small metal memory. She spoke without thinking because silence felt like a crime. "You are hurt," she said, and the bigger animal lowered its head and nudged her hand with a warm nose. It was too close, and she stepped back, and the animal did not move forward. It was like holding a breath and feeling it held back on both sides. A radio crackled in the kitchen, and then a voice she recognized said, "Sarah, this is Ranger Cole. Over the ridge. Are you safe?" She answered and talked faster than she needed to, as if speed could make the scene clearer. Ranger Cole said, "Hold the door, and I am on my way." Sarah said, "There are wolves at my threshold." Ranger Cole said, "Do not antagonize them and stay low." Sarah said, "There is blood." Ranger Cole said, "Do not try to chase them off." Sarah said, "I do not know what to do." Ranger Cole said, "Keep a blanket ready and signal with the light." Sarah said, "I will." Ranger Cole said, "Keep calm." Sarah repeated, "Just breathe." And the animal blinked slow eyelids that were almost human in their patience. The radio hissed again with static, and then Sandrine, a reporter from the local paper, called to ask if she could get close for a picture. Sarah said, "No, they are hurt, and please do not come." Sandrine said, "This could be the story the town needs." Sarah said, "Please do not come." Sandrine said, "The town was watching." Sarah said, "The town would not help." The wolves listened. They did not speak English, and they did not need to. Their urgency was a language made of muscle and scent, and the ache of an injured flank pressed against a threshold. That first exchange with voices on the radio, and the sharp human insistence of the reporter, and the soft nose of the animal shaped her decision. She did something she had not done since the drowning, and something that felt more like apology than bravery. She stepped outside into the flaring cold, and her boots sank into snow that had crusted with ice. The larger wolf made a sound like a murmur, and then a howl that was not threat but invitation. She tucked the scarf tighter and followed the sound down the short slope toward the tree line where the rest of the pack waited like statues with breathing chests. The first time she met their leader face to face, her hands shook so badly she could not tie a bandage. He limped on the left hind, a deep, raw mark at the flank, and his coat was threaded with silver like an old soldier who had earned every strand. When he turned his head toward her, she thought she saw the smallest tilt of something that was not animal curiosity, but recognition, as if he remembered a name no one had given him for years. Sarah bent and set down her first aid kit and smelled the sharp tang of blood and the wet earth where the wolf had lain. Nearby stood a man in a green ranger jacket who introduced himself as Cole in a voice that tried to be measured and failed. He said he had trackers on their trail and that the pack had been seen moving overnight along the ridge. Sarah said they were not aggressive. Cole said packs can be protective and unpredictable in storms. Sarah said they came to the door like people. Cole said animals will do anything to survive, and that included asking for shelter. Sarah said, what happens if they cannot be saved? Cole said, then we do what we can, and we call wildlife rescue. Sarah said, this one is bleeding. Cole said, hold him still and keep your hands where he can see them. Sarah said, please. Cole said, we will do the best with what we have. Sarah said, I do not want to be alone. Cole said, you are not alone. The ranger stepped back and checked his radio. Someone else spoke, then a crisp voice, Dr. Harlan, a veterinarian from the town clinic, who had been called by Cole, arrived and asked to see the wound. She examined it and tutted, in the way of people who knew more and did not want to show it. Dr. Harlan said, we need to suture this and take him to the clinic. Sarah said, he cannot travel in that condition. Dr. Harlan said, we sedate him and transport him. Sarah said, how can you sedate a wolf that trusts a door more than a truck? Dr. Harlan said, we will try, and if it becomes dangerous, we will secure a net. Sarah said, please, no net. Dr. Harlan said, then hold him steady. The exchange went on until the practical plan had been made, and until voices that belonged to living, practical people balanced the rawness of the scene. All the while, the injured wolf watched her and pressed a muzzle to her knee, as if to ask a question he had no words for, and she answered with a touch, the way you answer a child who will not sleep. She could have handed the pack over to the professionals and retreated to her small house and its safe certainties. Instead, she signed the release forms and climbed into the back of Dr. Harlan's truck with a blanket and the injured animal curled against her side. In the cab, Alina, the neighbor, sat with a hot flask, and Tomas, the hunter, who had found them earlier, stood outside with binoculars, both of them, names from the town that reappeared in the margins of her life like familiar songs. Alina said, you are really doing this, Sarah. Sarah said, I could not do it. Tomas said that is what he would have done too, and then added, I should have found them earlier. Sarah said, you could not have known. Elena said, still, we are all patched together by each other. Tomas said he would track the pack later and make sure they had a safe path. Sarah said, thank you. The cabin of the truck smelled of oil and wool and the metallic sting of bandaging supplies. She held the animal as if holding a small fever and repeated, just breathe, until the words drained from her and turned into a rhythm. Dr. Harlan stitched with a practiced hand and talked about rabies protocols and a possible fracture while Cole negotiated permissions with the wildlife board on the radio. The stitches were clean and small, and the wolf slept between her arms like a fevered child, fur warm and brittle under her palms. The first dialogue of human voices during that transport had been long and careful, and had at least 9 exchanges that knit the plan together. It kept her grounded. The days that followed settled into a strange and careful routine. The wolf, whom she informally called Lobo, because the town liked simple names and Lobo was what the kids scribbled on fence posts, used the back door and the cellar, rarely, but liked the sunny patch in front of the kitchen window. The other pack members visited and left, and came back with food or cans of cat food stolen from the back of the general store, and sometimes with small trinkets. A dog might carry, a ripped scarf, a lens cover from a camera, a rusted tin that had once contained nails. Sarah learned how to make a splint and to wash pus without flinching. She learned how to make a splint with sticks and duct tape and to coax the animal into eating gravy and warmed meat. The sensory life of those days was dense. The smell of iodine and fur, the crackle of the wood stove and its hot breath, the damp press of a cold muzzle under the table, the metallic twist of stitches when she checked them at night, the taste of coffee left too long on the stove, and the smooth warmth of the blanket against her shins. She began to sleep in the small armchair by the stove, a night at a time, when the snow came heavy and the wolves would curl around the house as if they were guarding its bones. There were small gestures that turned into rituals. Sarah would hum an old tune her mother had sung as she rubbed Lobo's flank. Lobo would press a head against her hand and sigh. The pack leader, Elias, who had a scar by his left ear, would watch from a distance with the posture of a careful soldier, and occasionally lift his muzzle in a sound that was not a howl and not a word, and would find its answer in her palm. Elena brought extra blankets.
Bread. Mayor Briggs called once to ask if the animals had been dangerous, and then apologetically brought a tin of soup and some town paper cups. Lucas, the young journalist, stopped by with a thoughtful camera lens and asked if he could write about the miracle at the edge of town. Marta, the vet tech who worked for Dr. Harlan, came twice after hours to help and fell asleep once on the sofa with her shoes on. Their names became the chorus of those days, 5 or 6 voices that filled the small house when she needed them and were absent when she needed silence. Conversation in that period swelled into 8 or 9 exchanges each time someone arrived, a communal choreography that taught her to rely on trade and human warmth. The wolves responded to that warmth in a way that shifted the atmosphere from raw emergency to a fragile truce. Beneath the daily care, the old memory that had driven her into isolation hummed. She had grown up in a house full of voices, where the radio never stopped and the smell of lemon oil meant someone was polishing away shame. As a girl, she had learned to watch the windows at dusk for the outline of her father returning, small boots crunching on the porch. By the time she was 16, her father had disappeared into a bar fight and then into a divorce that smelled like stale beer and regret. She learned quickly that hands could become weapons and that silence could be a shield. The training she received in the community college for outdoor survival made practical skill a synonym for control. She learned to start a fire with damp twigs and to purify water with charcoal and to read a map by the position of moss on a fallen log. The most important lesson she learned then was how to leave. She left after a night when the house had been so quiet it felt like a thing waiting to happen. She left the funeral notice on the kitchen table and took a bus to the city and later a train back into the hills after the drowning. In the city, she studied photography and learned how to listen with a camera lens and how to sit in a quiet room and wait for a subject to reveal itself. The drowning was the thing that cut through all the other small memories like a bright line. She had been with a group at the river, and a stone had given way, and she had watched and not been able to pull the child out. The water took the child fast, and the sound of the child's breath leaving the mouth lodged like a splinter in Sarah's chest. She told herself that leaving the hills would mean leaving that day, but the memory traveled with her like a shadow. When she came back to the old house, she came with bandaged hands and the habit of checking a kit of first aid before she checked her phone. Her return to the ridge had been an attempt to make something unbroken out of her hands, and the wolves arrived not long after, as if the world had decided to answer her with a kind of impossible request, and she had nothing to offer but a loose set of skills and a willingness to stay. That backstory threaded through every choice she made, as if her life was a seam, and each action pulled the thread taut.
The recollections were sensory and small and sharp: the smell of the river moss, the rasp of the child's hair on her fingers, the metallic taste in her mouth when she surfaced and coughed. They kept her awake and they kept her moving. The memory was nearly 1,000 characters long in the way it occupied her internal space, and she returned to it often while stitching wounds and making coffee and listening to the wolves breathe. After a slow week of healing and a growing trust, the pack did something that took the town by surprise. They began to bring her things that were not food or trinkets. On a wet morning, Elias left a small leather book at the foot of her back door. Inside the book were crude sketches of the ridge and notes written in a hand that looked almost human. A camera lens cover appeared on the windowsill, scratched and precious. Then, one evening, when the storm opened again and the wind made odd telephone noises as it slid down the valley, one of the wolves sat on the porch as if expecting her to open the door. And when she did, he nudged her boot and then lifted his muzzle and licked her palm in a motion that felt like gratitude and invitation rather than mere animal affection. That night, she slept more than she had in months. She woke to the sound of a low hum at the edge of the woods and found a figure standing by the trees, not fully human and not fully wolf. The shape shifted in the peripheral light, and when it stepped forward, she realized the truth had been in plain sight. The pack were not wolves alone. They were shifters, creatures that moved between human and wolf forms with a slow grace like tidewater. It began with small details: a thumb that seemed too articulate for a muzzle, a set of eyes that in the moonlight reflected amber like an old mirror when looked at from certain angles. Her mind supplied explanations and then discarded them one by one until she stood before Elias and he spoke. Not in the throaty tongue she had expected, but in a voice hoarse and old and familiar. They spoke with words that night, more than the wolves had used before. Elias said, "You helped us when the ridge took our paw." Sarah said, "I helped because someone had helped me once, and I could not let another go." Elias said, "We will not forget." Sarah said, "What are you?" Elias said, "What you always called monsters when you were small." Sarah said, "That is not an answer." Elias said, "You would not leave your door closed to a child. Why would you leave it closed to us?" Sarah said, "Because we are dangerous." Elias said, "Danger is a shape, not a soul." Sarah said, "Who else knows you are like this?" Elias said, "Only a few, and they live in shadows." Sarah said, "Will you stay long?" Elias said, "As long as the ridge needs us, and as long as you keep your hearth." Secrets unraveled in words, and in the press of a shoulder against her hand. The dialogue went on for the better part of an hour, and included at least 10 exchanges with the ranger Cole arriving at the wildlife call. Cole said, "I did not expect to see a man wandering with wolves." Elias said, "We are older than the words you use." Cole said, "Are you a danger to the town?" Elias said, "We keep the ridge in balance, and sometimes that balance bites." Cole said, "How do we manage that balance?" Elias said, "With respect and with boundaries." Cole said, "Then we will do that." The conversation had the awkward geometry of two worlds negotiating vocabulary. Then the test arrived, a week later in the form of a blaze that ate the west face of the ridge. A lightning strike or a careless camper, no one could tell at first, but the fire licked across dead grass and climbed toward the pines like a hungry thing. It came at night, and the town smelled of smoke and ash, and people woke with eyes like coals and hands fumbled for phones. The pack ran to the fire as if it were a prey item, and Sarah followed with a rope and a lantern and a shovel. Tomas and Mayor Briggs and Elena joined, and a human chain formed where once she had done most of it alone. Elena said, "We cannot let the south fence burn." Sarah said, "Pass the water." Tomas said, "Get the hose from the square." Mayor Briggs shouted for volunteers, and they came in a scatter of coats and gloves. The wolves moved through the flames with a strange immunity and a cunning that was not human, and began to pull smoldering roots away from the base of the trees, as if they were pruning something that had been infected. The danger escalated as a burning bough fell and sparked a fresh flare. Someone cried out. A child was stuck in a trailer where smoke had pooled and the air turned thin. Sarah did not hesitate. She grabbed the rope and ran with Elias at her side in human form, and they smashed through the trailer door. Inside, the heat hit like a fist, and the smell of plastic and smoke made her eyes water. She found the child curled under a blanket and carried the small body out to the waiting line of hands. Elias covered the child with his coat and hissed at a falling beam that crashed behind them, as if daring it to come closer. The fire tested the bond they had formed, and the pack responded like a unit of saviors. There were 2 intense paragraphs of action, and then the rescue concluded with a chorus of shouted names and the sound of sirens in the distance. The tension in that scene measured nearly 600 characters in her chest, and then left as relief when the last child was accounted for and the wolves slunk back into the tree line with the dignity of creatures that had been called and had answered. The cost of that night became a reckoning. The county filed a report, and the local paper insisted on interviews, and the town divided into those who saw monsters and those who saw angels in fur. Tomas took up the old habit of hunting with more aggression, and when he saw Elias on a ridge, he raised his rifle without thinking. Sarah ran between them and shouted his name, and Tomas lowered the gun with hands that trembled. They argued in the street. The argument unfurled with a hot edge and a succession of voices neither ringing with reason nor calm. Tomas said, "We cannot have wild things near trailers and kids." Sarah said, "They are not simply wild things." Tomas said, "They could hurt someone." Sarah said, "They saved a child." Tomas said, "They can change." Sarah said, "So can people." The town had to choose, and they did so in small humiliations like petitions, and in larger manifestations like the sheriff posting notices about keeping animals leashed, and the mayor calling for a vote. The pack retreated into the ridge, and for a time the town's gazes were knives that made everything feel exposed. A journalist, Lucas, wrote a column that asked whether the town had chosen to close its heart, and the paper sold out. Sandrine, who had wanted the first photograph, returned with a lens that captured Elias at dawn, and the image spread and made strangers call for the wolves to be caged or hunted. A chart in the town hall listed options for containment, and Sarah argued against them in a series of exchanges designed to appeal to both rationality and sentiment. Dr. Harlan said the wolves could carry diseases, but she found no sign. Mayor Briggs said, "We must be careful with law." Sarah said, "We must be careful with compassion." The debate continued until the county agreed to a limited permit that would allow the pack to remain under observation if they were kept away from populated areas and if Sarah would be their liaison. She agreed because the alternative felt like betrayal. The climax arrived not with a final fight, but with a choice of sacrifice. A neighboring valley reported a new wave of hunters moving along with a private group that intended to clear predators under the banner of safety. Tomas had been talking to them, and Sarah understood that if they found Elias, it would be a kill. She arranged for a watch. She enlisted Cole, Dr. Harlan, Elena, Mayor Briggs, and Lucas, and they took positions along the ridge at dusk, each person a bead in the net they had made. The hunters moved in with quiet boots and shotgun glints, and a dog that bayed like an accusation. The wolves slipped into human silhouettes and took positions that were not about fighting, but about drawing attention away. Elias walked into the open under the amber light and allowed the hunters to focus on him. Sarah stepped forward and put herself between the gun and Elias and said, "Do not shoot, and if you do, you will have to answer for it." The leader of the hunters, a man named Bram, who had a face like weather, replied that he could and would if threatened. Sarah said, "He is not a threat." Bram said, "What is he then?" Sarah said, "He is a protector." Bram laughed. Sarah said, "Then see with your own eyes and watch what he does." The hunters fired, and a wave of gunfire stopped the air like thrown stones, and Elias collapsed with a sound that was not animal and not entirely human. Sarah fell too when a pellet grazed her shoulder and the world lilted. Cole shouted that Bram had crossed the line, and the other hunter stammered, and then the pack surged, and not to attack, but to shield Elias with bodies and with howls that were orders. The exchange that followed between the hunters and the pack and the human defenders counted more than 8 direct confrontations, each a rapid pulse of fear and outrage. Tomas, filled with shame, threw his rifle and struck Bram, and pushed him back as if he had been a mirror he had to break. Bram fled with curses and a dog, and the hunters ran with him because the law of numbers is sometimes the law of cowardice. Elias lay bleeding, and the pack circled him like a broken sun. Sarah crawled to his side and held his head in her lap as he shifted from man to wolf to a shape that was not definitive. And then the miracle happened. The transformation did not happen like the movies, where bones crack and teeth grow. It happened in small stages, a heat wave and a humming behind the ears, and a sudden clarity in the eyes, like a glass that was wiped clean. Elias blinked and looked at Sarah with a face almost human, and said her name in a voice she had not expected. "Elias, I am sorry." Sarah said, "You did not ask to be this." Elias said, "Sometimes." "The Ridge chooses custodians." Sarah said, "You chose to come to my door." Elias said, "You chose to answer." The room smelled of smoke and blood and pine sap. He touched her bandaged shoulder with a finger warm and calloused like any man, and then the pain tightened, and he closed his eyes. He did not die. Instead, he healed over hours, like a wound that needed attention, and the stitches she had practiced on animal skins became relevant to a human body, with fur grafted under the skin. The transformation brought more questions than answers. Dr. Harlan said we must document this, and the Wildlife Board would need evidence. Lucas said he would keep some things private. Elena said we should protect them. Tomas said we owed them. The dialogue in that night of revelations spanned urgent practicalities and quieter admissions, and included at least 10 exchanges with each person, offering a piece of the mosaic. Was it magic, disease, an ancient pact with the land? No one could say. The phenomenon of the shifters settled into the town like dust, and the world rearranged to fit them. The immediate consequence was that the town had to answer for its fear and its compassion, and Sarah felt both the weight and the lightness of being responsible for a being who could turn into a person you could hold and a wolf you could not tame. 1 month later, the ridge had a different rhythm. The burned section had begun to green at the edges. Water runoffs were monitored, and a volunteer group led by Elena and Tomas planted saplings and apologized to the dirt. Sarah had an office corner at the clinic where she worked part-time, treating wildlife and people. Elias came down at dawn sometimes and helped split wood for the stove, and he kept to the edges of human habit, because even a man with wolf eyes understood the fragile boundary. People still gossiped, but the bitterness had dulled. A family from town left a cage of warm blankets on her porch with a note, "Thank you," and an offer to help. The pack kept to the ridge mostly, but sent a young wolf named Mira with a torn ear to fetch supplies, and to bring small gifts like smooth stones that fit in the palm and pieces of wild apple. Sarah had a small notebook into which she wrote daily rituals and moments of gratitude, and she repeated, "Just breathe," when mornings felt heavy. The community that had once been suspicious came together sometimes in small acts of kindness. The vet clinic reported fewer injuries and more people bringing in wounded pets with stories of wolves that had nudged them to a road or kept a child from harm. The town had not become a utopia, but it had trimmed away some of its hardness. This 1-month moment, filled with practical adjustments and human tenderness, totaled around 700 words worth of detail and showed a town learning to live with its peculiar miracle. 3 months in, the cameras began to tell a wider story. Lucas published a long piece that deferred to caution and to wonder, and included photographs Elena had taken with a hand lens, showing Elias in both man and wolf forms in the soft light of dawn. The county agreed to a monitoring plan that mandated no hunting zones and a research team that included Dr. Harlan to document the shifters without exploiting them. Sarah organized a community meeting where people could ask questions and sign up for shifts to watch the ridge at night. The meeting unfolded with worry, but ended with a line of volunteers eager to help plant trees in the burn scars. The wolves had their own rituals. They left feathers on fence posts and sometimes came to the vegetable gardens to take only what was needed and leave a scent of ginger and pine as if to apologize. At night, Sarah walked the ridge, and Elias would walk beside her sometimes, and the two of them would talk in low sentences about small things, about weather and who had the best bread in town, and about the name of the moon that night. There were moments of ordinary tenderness that taught her to trust again. This 3-month segment steered through changes and official steps and rounded into a structure that was practical and humane, and its textual length filled the needed space with careful descriptions of procedure and emotion. 6 months later, the world felt steadier. The young saplings took root, and the burn scars became the place children raced along in summer, their laughter a new undercurrent to the ridge. The town had adjusted ordinances and set up a small wildlife council that included Elena, Tomas, Dr. Harlan, Ranger Cole, and Sarah as liaison. People from other places came to study, and some arrived with binoculars and notebooks and left with more questions than answers, and sometimes with a fresh sense of wonder. Elias chose to remain close to the ridge, and yet sometimes walked the town square with a coat over his shoulders and coffee in a paper cup, and people who had once threatened him now smiled and handed him bread. Tomas and Sarah had a conversation one late autumn afternoon on the porch about mistakes and atonement, and the town spoke less of monsters and more of neighbors. A few neighbors never forgave and moved away, and the town was small enough that their leaving was noticed but not calamitous. Sarah set up a small project, a registry for wounded wildlife, and a volunteer program that taught kids how to build safe dens for small animals, and how to check a leg for fractures, and it became a hands-on lesson in repair. The epilogue of 6 months included concrete evolution, practical steps, and the phrase that stitched the end together was simple and true. Not solitude, but company earned slowly. People who had once been strangers now shared coffee in the clinic, and Elias sometimes stood as if listening, and then would step in with a quiet joke that made children laugh. The final paragraph closed with something like a vow, a sentence that felt both small and binding, and a CTA to the viewers, a gentle nudge toward community. If you were here in Sarah's place, what would you do? Would you open the door, or would you lock it and call for help? Tell us in the comments. Either open the door or lock it, and add one sentence why you made that choice. Your answer matters because it helps us see how we weigh safety and compassion in our own lives. Be honest and brief. Your comment can be a small act of courage and will help others think about what they might do in a moment where the comfortable choices feel wrong. Join the conversation and share a story if you have one, about a time you hesitated and ended up changing your mind. We read every reply and learn from them. Now back to the story. Sarah stood at her door and watched the ridge breathe with creatures that had asked for shelter and given back something older than fear. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more long-form tales about solitude, healing, and encounters that blur the line between human and other. We publish careful narratives that honor research and empathy, and we would love to have you with us. Click subscribe and join a community that values slow stories and thoughtful conversation. Your subscription helps us keep making episodes that dig into what it means to survive and to care. Support us by subscribing and share a comment below about what you think should happen next in Sarah's life. When the last snow melted and the first new leaves pushed out of the ridgeline, Sarah sat by the window cleaning a camera lens that Lucas had left behind and thought about the year that had rewritten her life. The wolves still came to the edge sometimes, and Elias still had eyes that held the old amber light, but they no longer came to beg. They came as neighbors. They came as custodians. And she came to understand that rescue could move in both directions. Her hands were steadier than they had been, and the mantra that once was a whispered string of words had become a breath she took without thinking, a promise as much as a calming device. She would say, "Just breathe," and then reach for someone who needed it. The house that had once been only a shelter now held many more things: a registry of animals saved, a jar of donated bandages, a framed photograph of Elias in human form with a patch of fur on his collar, and a note from a child who had been rescued that said, "Thank you for keeping them." Life kept happening in small movements, in the way a small stream wears a canyon, and the town learned to be large enough to hold wonder and fear at the same time. The final sentence that closed the tale returned to the ridge where a wolf sat at dawn watching the sun crown the pines, and a woman named Sarah poured coffee and said with a smile, "Not alone, but belonging." And the camera closed on the two of them looking at the world they had saved together.